When the sun rose over the Pacific skies in the early 1940s, Japan had already emerged as a formidable military empire. With a powerful fleet, massive warships, and an elite naval air arm, Japan was confident it could stand against any Western power. To many of its officers, the future of warfare would be decided in titanic naval clashes where battleships and aircraft carriers would deliver decisive blows. They called this concept the decisive fleet battle, a doctrine that shaped Japanese naval strategy throughout the first half of the 20th century. The roots of this belief went back to the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when the Japanese Navy defeated Tsarist Russia, sending shockwaves across the world. That victory instilled a conviction that only one climactic engagement, a new Tsushima, could determine the outcome of war. As a result, every resource from shipbuilding and training to operational doctrine was devoted to preparing for the ultimate showdown with the U.S. fleet. Within this mindset, submarines, despite proving themselves as deadly threats in World War I, were dismissed by Japan. Although they possessed advanced technology and long-range submarines, these were relegated to reconnaissance, shadowing enemy fleets, or occasionally striking warships. The idea of using submarines to wage commerce raiding, cutting supply lines, the lifeblood of any industrial economy, was almost entirely ignored. This neglect stemmed not only from the decisive battle doctrine, but also from the mindset of Japanese officers. In their military culture, attacking merchant ships was considered dishonorable and unworthy of the samurai spirit. Sinking a freighter loaded with rice or oil could never compare, in their eyes, to the glory of striking an American battleship. Thus, from the very outset of the war, Japan shackled itself, forfeiting the chance to employ submarines as a true strategic weapon. When war erupted on December 7, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved a stunning success. Several U.S. battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. Across Southeast Asia, Japanese forces surged forward, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Indonesia, lands rich in resources, especially oil. This string of victories only reinforced the Japanese leadership's belief that their doctrine was sound and their fleet invincible. Yet beneath this triumph, a silent danger was emerging. The United States, with its vast industrial base and massive naval reserves, began counterattacking not only with carriers and surface ships, but also with a little-noticed force: submarines. From the outset, U.S. strategy for its submarine fleet was clear. The primary mission was not to hunt Japanese battleships, but to strike directly at Japan's supply lifelines. With a nation almost entirely dependent on imported resources, oil, iron ore, rubber, food, Japan was extremely vulnerable. If the sea lanes from Southeast Asia to the home islands were severed, the entire war machine would grind to a halt. The Japanese, however, largely ignored this threat. In early war reports, when a transport went missing, causes were often listed as storms, drifting mines, or navigational errors. Rarely did commanders acknowledge American submarines as the culprit. This denial reflected not only stubbornness, but also the weakness of Japan's anti-submarine doctrine. Unlike the Royal Navy, which had struggled against German U-boats in World War I and quickly developed sonar, radar, and escort tactics, Japan made little investment in anti-submarine warfare. Convoys were poorly protected, radar was almost non-existent, and ASW strategy was fragmented. They clung to the dangerous belief that the vastness of the ocean itself would shield their shipping, a fatal misconception. Meanwhile, American submariners pressed on. At first, they too faced major challenges. The Mark 14 torpedo, their primary weapon, was notoriously unreliable, failing to detonate, detonating too early, or veering off course. Many skippers watched in despair as expensive torpedoes missed targets or worse, circled back toward their own boats. But unlike the Japanese, the Americans investigated thoroughly, fixed the flaws, and improved their weapons. By late 1943, the worst problems had been solved, and U.S. submarines became a deadly force. As America adapted and improved, Japan remained wedded to its decisive battle fantasy. Even as shipping losses mounted and supply lines from Southeast Asia came under relentless attack, many officers insisted these were only minor setbacks. They failed to grasp that every sunken tanker and ore carrier was steadily eroding Japan's war potential. This blindness was reinforced by national pride. To many admirals, it was inconceivable that a dishonorable weapon like the submarine, striking unseen from beneath the waves, could cripple a naval power. That arrogance prevented reform, ignored the lessons of World War I, and ultimately exacted a heavy price. In hindsight, it is clear that Japan entered the war carrying a built-in strategic flaw. They could win great naval battles and seize vast territories, but they were unprepared for a long conflict where logistics and economics would prove decisive. That fatal weakness would be exploited by America's sea wolves, silently stalking beneath the Pacific waves. When the Pacific War erupted at the end of 1941, the U.S. Navy did not yet possess a large submarine force capable of immediately confronting Japan. Its undersea fleet numbered just over 100 vessels, most of them Porpoise, Salmon, and Tambor-class submarines designed in the 1930s. While these boats had the range to reach as far as the Philippines or the Dutch East Indies, they had never truly been tested in a full-scale war. From the outset, the Americans viewed submarines very differently from the Japanese. Experience from World War I, when German U-boats strangled Britain's supply lines, had taught the U.S. Navy the strategic value of commerce warfare. Therefore, the mission was not to hunt Japanese battleships, but to strike at the supply network on which the Japanese Empire was utterly dependent. Early operational orders made this clear. The primary task of the submarine fleet was to disrupt Japanese shipping, regardless of old notions of honorable naval warfare that had previously limited such tactics. Theory, however, did not always match reality. In the early stages, U.S. submarines faced an enemy as formidable as the Japanese themselves, the Mark 14 torpedo. This new weapon was designed with a modern magnetic exploder intended to detonate beneath a ship's hull. In theory, a direct hit would fracture the keel and sink a vessel instantly. But in combat, the Mark 14 proved highly unreliable. Many submarine commanders recounted frustrating experiences, stalking a Japanese convoy, risking close approach, firing precious torpedoes only to see them miss, explode prematurely, or fail to detonate at all. Some torpedoes veered tens of meters off course. Others sank to the ocean floor and vanished. In rare cases, a torpedo even circled back, nearly striking the very submarine that launched it. At the time, the U.S. Navy trusted manufacturers and the weapons design bureaus. Many admirals refused to believe there were mechanical flaws, blaming poor gunnery or false reports from submarine commanders. This caused tension across the service. Frontline officers despaired as prey escaped, while in Washington the problem was downplayed or dismissed. It was not until mid-1943, after extensive field tests, that the Mark 14's defects were acknowledged. Magnetic exploders were overly sensitive. Depth settings were off, and contact pistols often failed to detonate. Once corrected, the torpedo became a powerful and reliable weapon. Technical difficulties were only part of the challenge. Initially, many submarine commanders were overly cautious. Lacking combat experience, they often avoided risk, firing from long range or missing opportunities. Success rates were low, and for the first 2 years the submarine fleet made little impact. Meanwhile, Japanese admirals remained confident that their shipping lanes were safe, reinforcing the illusion that American submarines posed little threat. However, by 1943, the situation began to change. Several factors converged to transform the U.S. submarine force from an ineffective arm into ocean predators. First, the torpedo problem was solved. After persistent reports from frontline commanders, especially those willing to test by firing at cliffs or derelict hulls, the Navy could no longer deny the issue. Technical improvements were implemented, turning the Mark 14 into a reliable weapon. Each torpedo launched now had a high probability of destroying its target, giving submarine officers much greater confidence in combat. Next, tactics were significantly improved. The Americans adopted lessons from their enemies, emulating the German U-boat wolf pack strategy. Instead of operating individually, submarines coordinated in groups, sharing information via radio and ambushing Japanese convoys together. When one submarine spotted a target, the entire group converged, creating a pincer that made escape nearly impossible. Intelligence provided another advantage. Thanks to the magic code-breaking system, the U.S. often knew Japanese convoy schedules in advance. Each time Japan deployed transports or moved troops, the signals were likely intercepted and deciphered, allowing U.S. submarines to lie in wait. The vast Pacific became a giant trap, with Japanese ships unaware of lurking enemies beneath the waves. Additionally, U.S. submarines were equipped with advanced radar. While the Japanese relied on the naked eye and periscopes, American subs could hunt even at night or in poor weather. Surface radar enabled detection of targets from afar, safe approach, and precise attack positioning, a technological edge the Japanese could not match. As a result, by late 1943, Japanese shipping losses began to soar. Oil, coal, and ore convoys were sunk in large numbers. Many transports from Southeast Asia arrived with only half their cargo. Japanese sailors were demoralized, yet commanders still refused to recognize the danger, blaming storms, mines, or maritime accidents. This denial prevented improvements in anti-submarine defenses, allowing the U.S. fleet to operate with increasing freedom. By 1944, U.S. submarine commanders became far bolder. They not only hunted merchant ships, but also targeted escort vessels and even struck Japanese ports when opportunities arose. Names like Richard O'Kane, USS Tang, and Dudley Mush Morton, USS Wahoo, became legendary, celebrated as sea wolves who struck terror into the enemy. This shift marked a new phase. From 1943 onward, the U.S. submarine fleet was no longer merely a support arm, but a strategic force directly crippling Japan's economy. Each sunken tanker, each lost ore shipment, was a blow to the heart of the empire's industrial power. As the war dragged on, this effect intensified, pushing Japan ever closer to collapse. In any war, accurately assessing the enemy is often as crucial as military strength itself. Yet for Japan in the Pacific, their greatest mistake was not just the loss of ships or the attrition of their fleet, but the prolonged denial of the threat posed by American submarines. From the very beginning, when the first convoys were sunk in 1942, Japanese commanders had the opportunity to recognize the danger. Instead of acknowledging it, they chose to evade the truth. In reports sent to Tokyo, ship losses were often attributed to violent storms, drifting mines, or simply maritime accidents. Rarely was it clearly recorded that the vessel had been attacked by a U.S. submarine. Why such denial? The answer lies in both military culture and human psychology. Even before the war, the Japanese Navy held near absolute faith in the decisive fleet battle doctrine. Officers were trained to believe that wars would be decided in massive engagements where battleships and carriers confronted each other. Within this framework, admitting that merchant ships or tankers, lacking heavy weaponry, had become strategic targets would mean acknowledging the failure of their entire doctrine. Moreover, in the spirit of Bushido, sinking a freighter loaded with coal, rice, or oil was seen as dishonorable. It brought no glory and did not demonstrate fleet power. For many admirals, accepting such losses as a cause of failure was intolerable. Thus, they rationalized, sometimes even deceiving themselves. Within the Navy, some younger officers recognized the danger and warned that without proper convoy systems and anti-submarine measures, Japan's economy would be strangled. But these voices were often silenced. Senior generals dismissed them as pessimistic speculation, sometimes mocking that U.S. submarines could do little more than minor harassment. Arrogance caused them to ignore warnings when there was still time to act. The consequence became painfully clear when the Americans gradually fixed torpedo flaws and improved tactics from 1943 onward. Japanese losses skyrocketed. Oil convoys from Indonesia, the empire's lifeblood, disappeared one after another. Yet instead of acknowledging that the enemy was operating freely beneath the waves, many reports still blamed mines or weather conditions. As one historian later noted, the Japanese Navy failed not only from a lack of ships, but from a lack of honesty with themselves. This denial also produced another effect: disastrously weak anti-submarine defenses. Compared with the British, who had survived the Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats, the Japanese Navy was almost unprepared for undersea warfare. Escort vessels were few, many without modern sonar. Radar, a key tool for detecting surfaced submarines at night, was virtually non-existent in the Japanese fleet until the war's late stages. When a convoy sailed from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, there were usually only one or two escort ships, far too few to protect dozens of slow, heavily loaded transports. Some convoys sailed entirely unescorted, relying on the hope that the vast ocean would shield them. Against an opponent equipped with radar and wolfpack tactics like the U.S., this was tantamount to offering prey straight to the wolves. Another problem was the lack of coordination among forces. The Japanese had warships and naval aircraft, but rarely deployed them to protect shipping lanes. Patrol planes were few and limited in range, while most air resources were devoted to decisive battles. As a result, U.S. submarines operated with near-total freedom, rarely threatened from the air. Even when escorts were present, effectiveness was low. Many captains lacked anti-submarine experience, did not know how to coordinate with sonar or depth charges. Depth bombs rarely hit targets, and most U.S. submarines escaped pursuit unharmed. This reinforced the Japanese belief that U.S. submarines were not dangerous, a bitter irony. Failing to catch the wolf only led them to underestimate the threat. Meanwhile, Japanese sailors at sea increasingly felt the peril. They recounted voyages spent staring tensely at the water by day and fearing every strange noise by night. Some believed U.S. submarines could smell oil or track the shadow of a ship under moonlight. These rumors reflected mounting panic, even as official reports maintained a calm tone. This vicious cycle between reality at sea and the High Command's assessments put Japan at a severe disadvantage. By mid-1943, Japanese shipping output had already dropped sharply. In 1942, the merchant fleet totaled over 6 million tons. 2 years later, that figure had fallen by half. Yet instead of issuing a nationwide alarm or concentrating resources on building escort ships and developing radar, the leadership remained preoccupied with new aircraft carriers or preparing for the decisive naval battle they were certain would come. It was not until late 1944, when oil supply lines from Indonesia were nearly cut off entirely, that Japan began to partially acknowledge the truth. By then it was too late. Shipyards lacked materials, aircraft had no fuel for training, and the once mighty fleet was reduced to steel hulks idle in port due to fuel shortages. Misjudgment had become a death sentence for the empire. The lesson of this prolonged denial is clear. In war, the bitter truth must be faced. When a nation deceives itself, it need not even wait for the enemy. The path to defeat is already laid. Japan in World War II stands as the clearest example of this reality. By the spring of 1943, the U.S. submarine war entered a new phase. The early years of uncertainty, faulty torpedoes, and undeveloped tactics had been replaced by professionalism and formidable firepower. The U.S. Navy not only corrected torpedo malfunctions, but also rapidly learned from the Germans in the Atlantic, adopting wolf-pack attack methods, using radar, and integrating ultra-intelligence. From this point on, American submarines became a razor slicing through the lifelines of Japan. Unlike Nazi Germany, which primarily targeted British shipping across the vast Atlantic, the U.S. submarine mission was far more precise and lethal, to destroy the oil supply routes from the Dutch East Indies, Malaysia, and the Philippines to Japan. In this strategy, every tanker and every convoy carrying coal, iron ore, or rubber became a critical target. The Americans understood that by severing these logistical arteries, Japan's massive war machine would choke. From mid-1943, solitary patrols gradually gave way to the wolf pack tactic. Previously, U.S. submarines operated alone, attacking targets individually. After learning from German U-boats, they began to operate in groups of 3 to 5, coordinating attacks. When one submarine spotted a Japanese convoy, it reported back, and the entire pack would intercept from multiple directions. This advantage rendered Japan's already thin escort forces virtually powerless. 1 or 2 escorts could not stop a pack of predators closing in from every angle under cover of night. Another breakthrough came from the advanced radar and sonar installed on U.S. submarines. At night, when most Japanese ships still relied on darkness as a shield, American submarines could detect targets from tens of kilometers away. Japanese sailors were often startled when torpedoes struck silently in the dead of night, with no warning of the enemy's presence. This growing terror spread anxiety throughout Japan's supply lines. Intelligence was also decisive. Thanks to the ultra-code-breaking system, the U.S. often knew convoy routes, schedules, and even the types of cargo being carried. This turned attacks into precise ambushes rather than random encounters. The combination of intelligence and skilled submariners transformed the ocean into a giant trap from which Japan could hardly escape. The results were evident in campaigns from 1943 to 1944. One of the first decisive blows was the destruction of oil tankers carrying fuel from Indonesia. In 1942, Japan still received over 20 million barrels of oil, By 1944, that number had fallen to less than a third. Each destroyed tanker left a towering plume of black smoke, representing both economic loss and a psychological blow. In the South China Sea, the waters between the Philippines and Taiwan became a Japanese convoy graveyard. U.S. submarines struck continuously, leaving Japanese forces in the Philippines. Indochina and Malaya virtually cut off. Many soldiers were left to starve on islands as supply convoys were destroyed before they could arrive. A notable example of submarine effectiveness was the destruction of convoy HI-71 in August 1944. This large convoy, transporting troops and supplies from Singapore to Japan with escorts, was hit over a few days by U.S. submarines. More than half the convoy was sunk, including troop transports. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned at sea before reaching the battlefield, demonstrating that even well-protected convoys were not safe. By late 1944, the situation became desperate. In that year alone, U.S. submarines sank over 3 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, nearly 50% of the remaining fleet. Oil supply lines were almost entirely severed. Without fuel, Japan's massive carrier fleet was immobilized in port. Aircraft lacked gasoline for training, soldiers went without supplies, and industry faced crippling material shortages. The pain was not only in the numbers, but also in Japan's inability to respond. Unlike Britain, which quickly developed escort tactics, radar, sonar, and anti-submarine aircraft during the Battle of the Atlantic, Japan accomplished almost nothing significant. Until the end of the war, most Japanese convoys remained poorly protected. Late-produced escort ships were insufficient in number, and crews were poorly trained. This delay reflected a tragic reality. While the U.S. treated submarine warfare as a strategic priority, Japan regarded it as a secondary theater. By the time they realized the danger, it was too late. By 1945, the crisis peaked. Domestically, Japan faced severe fuel shortages. Civilians burned wood instead of oil. Trucks ran on gasifier coal, and planes often had no fuel to take off. Remote garrisons were abandoned, leaving thousands of soldiers to starve. Meanwhile, once mighty fleets sat idle in ports, helpless against continuous U.S. air attacks. Post-war military historians estimate that 56% of all Japanese merchant shipping sunk in World War II was due to U.S. submarines. The figure speaks for itself. With less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower and resources, submarines inflicted over half of Japan's total shipping losses. Few naval campaigns in history have achieved such devastating efficiency. In post-war memoirs, some Japanese officers admitted they were shocked by the level of destruction wrought by U.S. submarines. Admiral Takagi later wrote, "We had prepared for a decisive fleet battle, but not for an undersea war." By the time we realized, it was too late to change our fate. The American submarine war was not just about numbers or sunken ships. It was an invisible blockade. It gradually strangled resource-dependent Japan. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's economy and military had already collapsed months earlier, largely due to this undersea blockade. In short, if the atomic bomb was the final blow forcing Japan to surrender, it was the U.S. submarine campaign that had steadily severed the lifelines of the empire, rendering its military plans illusory. This was the silent, yet devastatingly effective impact of the U.S. submarine force in the Pacific. By 1945, Japan was no longer the mighty empire that had once struck fear across the Asia-Pacific. On the surface, the Japanese military still possessed a massive fleet and hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed across China, Indochina, the Philippines, and remote islands. But internally, this giant had been drained of life, and the main cause was none other than the American submarine war, a silent but devastating blockade beneath the ocean waves. In fact, by late 1944, Japan's economy was nearly paralyzed. Oil supplies from Indonesia and Malaya, which had sustained the entire Navy and Air Force, had been severed. Imported oil fell to only a fraction of pre-war levels. Cold statistics illustrate the scale. In 1941, Japan imported over 20 million barrels of oil. By mid-1945, the figure was almost zero. Stockpiles quickly ran dry. Many aircraft squadrons had no fuel for training. Military trucks were forced to run on gasifiers, and massive warships sat idle in ports, becoming easy targets for American bombing. Not only fuel, but other strategic materials, steel, iron ore, coal, rubber, were also blockaded. U.S. submarines constantly intercepted shipping through the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and along the Philippines-Japan routes. As a result, many defense factories operated at minimal capacity, production lines stalled, and some facilities were forced to shut down due to material shortages. Meanwhile, civilian life deteriorated. Food was scarce, with rice and sweet potatoes becoming staple rations. Convoys carrying rice from Southeast Asia never arrived, having sunk along with tens of thousands of sailors. At the front lines, conditions were even more dire. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers stationed in the Philippines, Indochina, Indonesia, and the Mariana Islands were left starving. Supply convoys either never arrived or were decimated by U.S. submarines, leaving only a few scattered survivors. Some units on remote islands survived on wild vegetables and roots, becoming ghostly figures wandering the forests. Many did not die from bullets, but from hunger, thirst, and disease, a direct consequence of the underwater blockade. Meanwhile, in Japan itself, the once proud fleet had become mere shadows of its former self. The colossal battleship Yamato, the Imperial Navy's ultimate pride, remained immobile for nearly all of 1945 due to fuel shortages. When it was finally ordered to sea in April 1945 for Operation Tengo, it was no longer a strategic mission but a suicide sortie. Yamato sailed without enough fuel to return and was quickly sunk by U.S. aircraft within hours. This tragedy clearly demonstrated that even a steel giant built through skill and sacrifice is just a floating coffin without fuel. From the beginning of 1945, U.S. Air Forces conducted devastating bombings across Japan, culminating in the 2 atomic bombs in August. Yet many historians argue that even without the atomic bombs, Japan was already on the brink of collapse. The reason is simple. The country had been cut off from all supply lines and eroded daily by submarine warfare. The numbers illustrate the destruction. U.S. submarines sank roughly 1/100 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 5 million tons, nearly 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. In addition, more than 200 warships were destroyed. With only about 2% of the U.S. Navy's total strength, the submarine force delivered a lethal blow to Japan's economy and military. Few campaigns in modern history have achieved such devastating efficiency. After the war, when Japanese documents were declassified, Japanese officers themselves admitted their helplessness. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the Navy Chief of Staff at the war's end, bitterly wrote, "We prepared for a decisive fleet battle, but we lost the undersea war. And by the time we realized it, it was too late." This confession encapsulates the entire tragedy. Japan fought a war for which it was unprepared, unwilling to acknowledge, and ultimately unable to win. Strategically, the American submarine campaign offers several important lessons. First, it demonstrated that a small, well-organized, technologically equipped force with clear objectives can defeat a mighty empire. While Japan focused on massive warships, the U.S. attacked the enemy's economic lifelines and succeeded. Second, it underscored the value of technology and intelligence. Radar, sonar, improved torpedoes, and the ultra-code-breaking system turned U.S. submarines into invisible daggers, striking anytime, anywhere. In contrast, Japan's conservatism and slow development of anti-submarine measures effectively tied their own hands. Third, it reminds us that wars are not decided solely by major battles, but by invisible logistics. Japan lost not only to atomic bombs or isolated naval engagements, but because its supply lines were cut day by day. This lesson remains relevant in modern warfare, where logistics and supply chains are key to maintaining military strength. Today, scholars regard the U.S. submarine campaign in the Pacific as one of the most effective naval campaigns in history. With a relatively small force, they achieved decisive strategic objectives. If the atomic bomb was the final blow forcing Japan to surrender, the submarine war was the silent yet fatal cut, leaving the enemy powerless to resist. Looking back, Japan's collapse in 1945 resulted from multiple factors: U.S. industrial superiority, aerial bombardment campaigns, declining morale, and ultimately the atomic bombs. But amid all these causes, submarine warfare stands out as a red thread, quietly severing the empire's lifelines. Without fuel, without raw materials, without supplies, even the grandest military plans became futile. And that was the tragic yet inevitable fate of Japan in World War II, a power that once conquered half of Asia and challenged the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, ultimately fell not only under bombs from the sky but also under the silent strikes from beneath the sea. The American submarine campaign proved a timeless truth. In modern warfare, no nation can survive if its supply lines are severed by its enemy.